creativity in progress. Hello and welcome to Creativity in Progress, where we talk about creativity in a podcast. My name is Nathan Beatty, and here with me I have
Ethan Murphy, Nathan Beatty's friend.
Hello, Ethan. How are you doing today?
I can drive for Lyft. It's the small victories that count.
Yes.
Now, we are definitely not endorsed or paid by Lyft at all in any capacity, but Nathan and I have both driven for Lyft for, I've driven for about a year and a half. How long have you driven for Lyft, Nate? It's been a while.
It's been just under a year. I started doing it pretty much like almost around the same time a little bit before we started the podcast, which was almost about a year ago. About a year.
Right. Wow. So as listeners know from last week and maybe previous episodes, how the journey to be able to drive legally for Lyft in California is a long and treacherous, arduous one. You have an easier time getting the ring into Mordor blindfolded and having Gollum gnaw on your leg, but it's done. And this weekend I made all kinds of cash doing it.
Awesome.
So it was fun. It's the small victories. It's the small victories.
Small victories.
But how are you, sir? How are you?
I'm doing good. I've been busy. Extremely busy. Y'all can't see it, but I have redone the studio again because it seriously is a problem. Like I really need to talk to somebody because I just keep changing stuff.
Is the studio a problem, or is the fact that you have to keep changing it, like the fact that you can't stop neurotically changing it, a problem?
Both. So it's fair. One of those things. But enough of that though. We need to get to our guest today. Today, we have I'm just really excited about this, and I'm vamping because I got Chris's name, but Nathaniel, I don't have your last name. So we're doing a little vamp.
Professionalism to the end.
Yes, it's okay. I'm here, and I can provide it on cue. So
okay. So here we have Chris and Nathaniel. Chris and Nathaniel, can you introduce yourselves?
My name is Chris Gavaler.
And I'm Nathaniel Goldberg.
Awesome. Nathaniel and Chris, thank you so much for being on the show today. And can you give us, a little bit of rundown? We know you're here because of your book that you wrote. That again, I'm vamping because I'm in the book and I can't get to the title. I have all my notes, but I don't have.
Superhero Thought Experiments, Comic Book Philosophy.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Newly published from University of Iowa.
Yes, it is awesome. Superhero Thought Experiments, Comic Book Philosophy by Chris Gavaler and Nathaniel Goldberg. Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Sure. So Chris, my co-author, is Chris, world-renowned or at least highly regarded scholar about comic books. And I teach philosophy, and the two of us thought we'd get together one day, and we wrote this book. And the book argues that superhero comics in particular are a great way to understand what thought experiments are, and that each one contains one or more different ways to think through various sorts of situations.
Awesome. Amazing stuff. And so my first question is, what made you guys to decide to write a book addressing superheroes or comic books or what have you through such a philosophical lens? What on earth made you guys decide to come up with that as a subject matter for a book?
Well, there was a lot of luck involved. Nathaniel and I met by accident. We both work at the same university, and by dumb luck, one morning he happened to be in the copier room of the English department where I work. It turned out that the philosophy department's copier was broken, so he just happened to be down there Xeroxing something. And he introduced himself, and he had a vague sense of who I was because I embarrassed myself weekly at my college by publishing a blog post every week and then linking to it on campus notices. I think he had seen me posting about superheroes, and he was very nice and said, well, philosophers also often use odd subject matters to write about. And he had told me that he wrote on a philosophical thought experiment called the Swamp Man. which I'd never heard before, but it reminded me of the comic book, The Swamp Thing, by Alan Moore. And so I went home, pulled out my copy, handed it to him the next time I saw him. We got, I think, coffee together, and that started things rolling.
Awesome. That's awesome stuff.
That's awesome. I really like as I mentioned, I'm working my way through it. I liked the particularly in the first chapter, which it took me like 3 times as long to get through the chapter because I kept stopping and like highlighting and making notes, and like my notes in the book are like it, and I'm sitting here, like I get near the end of the chapter and I'm like, I'm reading this like I'm in their class.
Right.
That's a compliment.
The next question I had was just like, in your own words, both, Nathaniel and Chris, what exactly is a thought experiment to the layperson listening?
Sure. So I guess I'll tag team that in.
Yep.
Yeah, so thought experiments are like laboratory experiments where you take a bunch of, I guess, a circumstance or situation and you change one thing about it. You mix 2 chemicals that normally wouldn't be mixed together, or you dissect a creepy crawly in a way that it normally wouldn't be to see what's inside. Only a thought experiment, you do the mixing and the dissecting just in thought, or just conceptually. So instead of taking things physically apart, you take things intellectually apart. And usually you do this, at least in philosophy, because you're trying to get at some core meaning or some big lesson. So what happens if we try to picture a world in which everything is the same as it is on this world, except one little tiny thing is different? Would our words mean the same thing if they do there as they do here? And then as Chris and I started comparing notes on this, we realized that, oh my gosh, all these thought experiments that philosophers have been doing seem to have parallels in superhero comic books.
Oh yeah, it's if you are aware of philosophy in even at a cursory level, and you address this in your intro, where like you list out a whole bunch of scenarios that all seem like they came from the pages of Marvel or DC or Image or what have you. And at the end of the paragraph, you're like, and these are all thought experiments from famous philosophers. And
yes, yeah.
And it's like, oh, wow, that's kind of crazy when you think about it. Because if you've never approached it like that, you might not, it's very easy to miss that connection. And when I read that, I was like, oh, this is amazing. And I just like to open.
And I don't think that was an accident. I think that lots of these writers were. I mean, early on in the book, obviously, you guys are big fans of Superman and Batman. And you're on, I think, the first or second chapter, I can't quite remember now. You guys talk about utilitarianism. And obviously, John Stuart Mill, who actually, I'm a fan of his also because of The Good Place, the TV show, talks about the whole idea of more or less the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. And actually looking through that prism of utilitarianism with Batman or Superman, and obviously it's sort of like one of the thought experience you guys have or mentioned is the idea of Superman has the ability to pretty much save everyone in the world at once to some extent, more or less, but even doing that could have consequences. So how is it possible for him to basically, what is the best way for Superman to save the most amount of people where it still benefits the most amount of people without doing the most amount of harm accidentally? And that's a weird thing to think about. It's something that actually is, bizarrely enough, pretty fun, but also it's so heavy, it's so like out there that it's something I hadn't, as a writer myself, I hadn't actually given that much thought to until I saw it in your own words in these books, in this chapter. So it's a...
That chapter was particularly fun because we placed it first because it's also looking at the first year of superheroes, at least in comics. So we looked at the first year of Batman and the first year of Superman. So we're in 1938, 1939. And those characters are not the same Batman and Superman that we tend to think of as the contemporary characters in films. They're both rather lethal and far more violent and just odd in a variety of ways. So it was interesting to sort of go back to the very beginning, because even though those characters evolved, that first year was really the defining year for the moral basis of superheroes. And Superman and Batman are remarkably different. They're really working with very different ethical codes, even though they're both considered superheroes, obviously.
Right, absolutely. And kind of looking at it through the lens of retroactively, if you think about it, if you were to pretty much have a little kid like Bruce Wayne, a little kid like Clark Kent put in a lab and experiment on them in a way, all these hundreds and hundreds of stories basically are a giant experiment on what it would do to two people's psyches and their growth, essentially.
Well, I liked how talking about how, like you said, looking at the first year of Superman and the first year of Batman, and then contrasting that with the Watchmen and the Dr. Manhattan and Rorschach, and how essentially if you take the thought experiment of Batman and take it to its ultimate end, you get Rorschach. Exactly. And the same thing with Dr. Manhattan. And I thought that was fascinating because it took it to a point where, like, what would Superman do in the situation of Dr. Manhattan? You know what I mean? Like, right. It's that's just very interesting to me, and I loved how you guys did that.
Yeah, and in some ways, the Watchmen scenario is a cleaner version of the thought experiment. Because one issue that Chris and I realized is that even if Batman and Superman have different ethical codes, still the way the stories are written, they usually have happy endings, or usually right triumphs over wrong. Mm-hmm. Just because comic books tend to go along, at least in that era, tend to go along that sort of trajectory. Whereas in the Watchmen, you can debate at the end of the graphic novel or the end of the movie whether Dr. Manhattan did the right or wrong thing. Mm-hmm. So in that way, it's really, I think, testing the two different theories more cleanly. And maybe it's worth just mentioning what the two different theories are, just so listeners get some of an idea.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Chris, I'll do, or I'll just repeat or do utilitarianism, and I'll tag you in for deontology. Okay, so utilitarianism is a kind of view called consequentialism, and it basically says the ends justify the means. We should always try to get the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And in the case of Superman, he says things along those lines, but he's just such a powerful superhero, even in his beginning, even in his origin stories, that usually the conflicts don't come up quite as sharply as they do later in the Watchmen. But anyway, utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number, maximize happiness, minimize pain.
And now to build on that, so Superman, from the very first Action Comics #1, Jerry Siegel writes, Superman decided from an early age to turn his titanic strength into channels that would benefit mankind. I'm obviously quoting here, which really is, that future focus, benefit everyone. That's actually a very close approximation of utilitarian. Where compared this to Batman, in his origin story, which comes several issues into his run, little Bruce Wayne, after his parents are killed, and I'm going to quote again, I swear by the spirits of my parents to avenge their deaths by spending the rest of my life warring on criminals. That is a radically different goal. Notice that he's not trying to have any benefits for anyone. He's just sworn to do his duty to avenge his parents, which matches up to deontology quite well. And I know that Nathaniel actually described that in more detail.
Sure. So deontology, one way of understanding it is it's not the end justifies the means. It's you should do your duty, fulfill your promises, keep your pledges, whatever that might happen to be for whatever you pledged it to be. And
I'm sorry, I'll just say real quick, Nathaniel or Chris, from that lens, would you say that Batman's goals are self-serving? In other words, basically, is he doing what he's doing, all the crime he's fighting, all the villains he's taking down? In a way, is that just for his own selfish interest? Is it almost like he's not? Yes, mankind is benefiting from what he's doing, but is he only doing it because he himself has that desire?
He's doing his duty, but his duty is not to do good. So one of the disturbing things about that first year of Batman is if you read it closely, he's not concerned about the well-being of other people. There's when the Joker is first introduced, he's a serial killer, and at one point Robin asks, the Joker makes a threat, and Robin says, should we go prevent this person from being killed? And Batman says, no, it's not time yet. We need to gather more information. He has absolutely no interest in saving anyone. His only goal is to battle criminals. That's it. He doesn't even have to win. It's just the battle is the reason he's doing it.
Right. Yeah. Oh, it is very disturbing. Yeah. I know, obviously, and it seems like Superman obviously would lie down in traffic to save anyone. He would suffer to the nth degree. So it is a perfect kind of way to look at and compare these two superheroes with their philosophies. They themselves have philosophies that are directly tied to philosophers from the past. It's interesting.
It's interesting. You were talking about how he's willing. Sorry, I'm thinking about a specific scenario that happened in a recent Batman comic book, fairly recent, about 18 years ago now.
Nice, we're getting old.
But it was the run of Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee. It was the Batman Hush series.
Yes.
And in that, there's a scenario where Superman gets brainwashed by Poison Ivy, and so he's, he is battling Batman. It is the first official battle that they had in the actual normal continuity of comics. And Batman wins because he gets Catwoman to take Lois Lane and drop her off a building, because he knows that no matter what, Superman will get out of the brainwashing to save Lois Lane. And it's interesting because like you were saying, he's willing to pretty much do anything just as long as he's following his code. But at the same time, he's using someone as a, and so it's like, that's where he gets really fuzzy with Kant. You know what I mean?
Right. Because that's a good point, because he's not the same kind of deontologist as Kant is, certainly. I think Nathaniel can speak more to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And part of the issue is because, as Chris mentioned, these characters have evolved so much over the decades that it's hard to always put them in neat little boxes. But we think that the first year of each does make a cleaner case. And I'm not a Watchmen expert, but in a way, I think that is cleaner still. So I'm thinking now about how, I guess, the story behind it. It's not just Dr. Manhattan. He picks up the utilitarian gauntlet from Veidt, from Ozymandias, who, at the end of the story, at the end of the graphic novel, he's willing to sacrifice millions of people to save billions of people. Because at the end of the day, for him, it's still the greatest good for the greatest number.
Right. Which is still actually Mills. That's
still actually Mill. And then Rorschach just takes over the deontological line and says, I don't care about the consequences. I have to tell the truth because I'm duty bound to reveal this for the evil that it is.
Exactly.
And they duke it out, and then Rorschach accepts his fate because he'd rather, spoilers here, he'd rather, I won't give too much away, but let's just say it rhymes with caporizing. Caporizing.
Right. No spoilers, but
no spoilers.
Rorschach go boom.
But he'd rather do that than deal with sacrificing innocent people, because the ends don't justify the means for him, but they do for Ozymandias.
What's also interesting about that too is how Rorschach, pretty much, he knows he's walking to his death, trying to defy Ozymandias, so he's still willing to die for the greater good, essentially. And I guess that begs.
He is
for his duty.
In a way,
for his duty, he wouldn't die for his duty.
Because he says explicitly, he understands that if the information gets out, it will undermine everything that Ozymandias was trying to do, and which will result in not preventing a World War III and billions die. And in his ethical math means, sure, it doesn't matter if billions die. I am personally duty bound to do what I consider the right thing.
That's true.
Which is pretty dark.
Yeah, it's horribly dark. If he does his duty, he could literally cause the deaths of billions of people through a war, which is a horrible thing about it, which is very unheroic. Yeah.
And it's no coincidence. Alan Moore, of all a range of excellent comic book writers out there, he was interested in philosophy, and so this is not a coincidental thing that Alan Moore just happened to trip over. I think he had this very much in mind. And Moore, he's in the book a couple times because he's a particularly engaging, at least philosophically engaging author.
Yes. I mean, you guys mentioned there's another chapter about what's called swamp people or swamp.
Yeah. So Alan Moore, actually one of the first comic he wrote for DC, he took over a series, pretty obscure series at this point, called Swamp Thing.
Yeah, amazing series.
Yeah, really. Yeah. And it's interesting because it was originally when it was written in the early 1970s. I won't go into great detail, but basically it's the standard transformation story, and this scientist is turned into basically a giant monstrous plant. And when Moore got hold of it, he thought it was like one of the most ridiculous characters ever created. And he did a really interesting retcon. He decided that scientist, that didn't happen. The scientist died, and the special, serum that seeped into the swamp convinced the plant that it was a person. And then the character for all these years was really not that scientist, but just a diluted sentient plant. Somehow acquired the memories of the original character. That has a remarkable resemblance to a thought experiment by Donald Davidson called The Swamp Man, and he posits and it's explicitly a thought experiment. Actually, I'll let Nathaniel.
Sure, I can describe it. So I'm checking our notes. I guess, Chris, as you had pointed out, it was in the third year of the run of Moore's saga of the Swamp Man, so it was fairly new and still being written, that this philosopher in California and at UC Berkeley named Donald Davidson came up with this thought experiment. He had us imagine what would happen if you were standing in a swamp near a dead tree and lightning struck you and you were caporized or vaporized. And out of completely different atoms and elements, your double or duplicate or doppelganger formed. And he called that creature the Swamp Man. And in his experiment, he imagines that the Swamp Man moves exactly as you do or as you did because you're no longer around, and seems to greet your friends and seems to say hello and speak to everyone that you had spoken to. But then Davidson uses that as a thought experiment to try to get us thinking about what's the nature of meaning. And it's basically this. He asks us the question, if this swamp man that formed out of in a swamp, completely different molecules just coincidentally created, happens to talk to someone, is the swamp man really saying anything meaningful? Or is it just a bunch of sounds that would be meaningful if you said it, but you're not there? This is just sort of a zombie that came out of the swamp.
Yeah.
The key is that the swamp man didn't learn words. And so even though it's got this thing that's like a brain that apparently is able to produce sounds that sound like words, it's not aware that the sounds it makes have meaning.
And that's really cool too, because I'm familiar with Moore's run on Swamp Man. I haven't the Swamp Thing. Sorry, Swamp Thing. I didn't read anything about Swamp Thing before Alan Moore, but I know from what I understand about the character too, he is somewhat in the Mills camp because he's only from the perspective of caring about the swamp and nature. That's his main.
Interesting.
His main duty is so to speak, is protecting Mother Nature and protecting the swamp to the point where he doesn't care about mankind nearly as much. He's not. That's not his goal. I guess
that's interesting.
Yeah.
No, so his greater good just happens to focus on something other than human beings.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Interesting.
But I guess at the same time, it's still like he wouldn't harm anyone. He just wouldn't go out of his way to save them. It's interesting. Okay, very cool. But going back to what you guys were saying though, too, the idea of basically a swamp man being a reflection of us, would it make sense to anyone but us? Would it even make sense to us if it's a true reflection of ourselves? I mean, would we recognize ourselves?
Yeah. So what we did with the chapter, the thought experiment, was Chris pointed out that the pre-retcon Swamp Man, or Swamp Thing, the one created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson a couple decades earlier, actually was connected in a physical way to a man who was taken over by plants and became the Swamp Man or the Swamp Thing. So the original version, there was a connection between, say, if you were in the swamp and whatever chemicals or toxic sludge, whatever it was that turned you into a swamp creature, there's still a connection between you and that creature. So you know what your words mean because you learn them in school and by talking to people, your friends and your parents. So the swamp creature speaks the way that you would, only, is now a swamp creature. And we use these two different versions, the retconned one, Moore's one, where it's just a coincidental creation, and the original one where there's actually a connection, to try to pull apart some of Davidson's own views. So I guess as you were just saying, and I'm sorry, Nathan, no, Ethan.
Yes,
it's so good that, like my name, you guys know this, that Chris is the outlier, the three of us are.
I'll be okay.
Yeah. Well, anyway, maybe it was Ethan, I don't know. But you were saying a reflection of us. So Davidson has a separate theory that as long as we can make sense of people, that's enough for us to count them as speaking and meaning things. So in a way, he's got two different notions of what it is for people to think or mean things. In a way, he's actually appealing to the pre-retcon Swamp Man, the original one, and Alan Moore's later one. And it was trying to work these things through with the comic book history that got Chris and me thinking, actually, about all of this stuff.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
If I can add, Nathaniel, check me on this one. For the idea that for a word to be meaningful, it merely has to be interpreted as being meaningful, doesn't Davidson have another thought experiment involving aliens?
Oh, involving aliens.
An alien language.
Sure. It's not as vivid, and I want to, if I could put a footnote in that and come back to the point of being vivid. It's not as vivid. He just sort of throwaway line. Could we imagine a language that's completely alien to our language, like Martian or Neptunian or Vulcan? And his point is, well, if we could interpret it, then I guess it's not all that alien after all.
Right.
Is that what you were getting at, Chris?
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
What's interesting about that, though, is the idea that, in a way, it's trying to, like, would an alien in a human or earthling have the same kind of understanding of an idea? Like, for in the movie, I'm not sure you guys have seen the movie Arrival with Amy Adams. The aliens that they're talking to, they don't have the same concept of certain things that we do. So for them, the word war doesn't actually mean fighting. It means the idea of engagement with with another clan or whatnot. It's how you interpret or how your brain understands an idea. So based on what you're saying with Davidson, or if Davidson wrote the book about aliens and communication amongst different species or whatnot, it does boil down to also your own personal experiences. If I've never experienced a flying ship that's my home, it'd be hard for my brain to wrap itself around the concept of calling that binky, essentially. So it's a different kind of way of trying to reorganize what your brain thinks to understand something.
Sure. So not to get too far in the weeds in this, I'll try just to skim the swamp and not get so much in it.
Nice pun.
Yeah, but Davidson's model of interpretation, which is actually different from his Swamp Man thought experiment, in a way, it's different from it, but it's sort of tangled up with it. His model there is that when we interpret each other like you're doing with us, hopefully, we usually do it against some kind of shared background. Like we're all talking about the book that Chris and I wrote, or we're talking about comic books, so we have that in common. And if you see a spaceship and somebody, or you see two people fighting and somebody says that looks warlike, and someone else says it just looks like they're playing games, or it's kind of engagement but not a battle, we're interpreting each other in front of and in the presence of the people doing this. So yeah, it's, as you were saying, it's the experiences we have, including when we talk to each other, that informs what we mean.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Interesting.
It's fascinating because taking that particular comment there, it's kind of that highlights, like, I guess, for lack of a better term, in jokes. Like, when a when a comment is made on a message board or on a TV show or something, and it has a deeper meaning that only people who may have seen that piece of media or read that thing would pick up on. And I just find that interesting. I know it's not necessarily directed to the topic at hand, but it just seemed interesting to me.
Well, actually, if I can connect it's making me think, actually, Nathaniel said just a minute ago about not wanting to go too deeply into the weeds. This difference of sort of background and approaches to language, to ways of thinking. Nathaniel and I are actually coming from very different schools of criticism. I'm a literary critic. Nathaniel is a philosopher, and one of the earliest things we had to learn was how to merge those two approaches. Literary critics tend to be, I discovered working with Nathaniel, a lot less precise, but they also tend to be, they make broader, sometimes more interesting claims, but the imprecision is a problem. Mm-hmm. I would say philosophy reverses that, meticulously covering of ground, which means you can't cover as much ground. Mm-hmm. And so we went back and forth trying to figure out, well, how can we work together? I remember one of the first things we did with the Swamp Man, Swamp Thing chapter. I do genre, and so I immediately started researching every Swamp Thing, Swamp Man character through comics, and earlier it came up with 6 examples, and I Xeroxed them and brought them in. And he looked at me like I'd lost my mind because it looked like he said I had enough material there to write a book. I'm like, no, this is just a little section. I was covering the entire terrain, and of course, and we figured out, a way to balance it. But it was an interesting early challenge. Just our settings were different.
But I like that a lot, actually, because that kind of evokes an overarching idea that seems to work amongst all kinds of storytelling and collaborations in general, is the idea of having 2 different schools of thought or 2 different philosophies, and when the 2 are work together, having in the middle sometimes is where the sweet spot lies best. Mm-hmm. So that's really cool.
Yeah, no, I agree and endorse all of that, and I wanted to add to it. I don't know if I said I wanted to put a footnote on the word vivid or a marker on the word vivid, but
you did.
Yeah, but I did have in mind that something that comics do really well, and literary critics who work on comics are aware of, is how vivid the stories are. So not only do they have words, but they have images. And not only do they have images, but the images tell a narrative. Yes. It's not just a dry, academic, analytic, desiccated sort of description of a thought experiment. Mm-hmm. It's, in a way, a living, breathing story with living, breathing, albeit comic, fictional characters. And something Chris and I noticed really early on was just the way that a philosopher would describe in a paragraph a thought experiment. And someone like Alan Moore would take, an entire comic to do the same thing, in some ways to better effect, because you get to live in the world. Mm-hmm. You're not just sort of analyzing the thoughts. Right. So that's been really good about bringing our approaches together.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or a series like that, because Watchmen is 12 issues long. So it's pretty much like a 12 issue, or I think it was over a year. Each came out one issue a month. That's like a 1 year thought experiment. So basically you have your whole time to really get entrenched in it and have a wider scope and understand what's happening, as opposed to a quick little snapshot of things.
Yep.
Okay, so I have an idea for y'all's next book. Stick with me. And the reason is, as we're talking about all this, there were 2 things that keeps popping up in my mind, particularly when you were talking about like vivid and story, and I fully agree that the medium of comics is an excellent a way to be immersed within a story, and like, because not only like you said, not only you're reading it, but you're seeing it, but one thing kept bubbling up in my mind while y'all were talking, and that is, there are 2 video games. Stick with me. There are 2 video games that I kept thinking about, and the one is Detroit Become Human, and the other is Horizon Zero Dawn.
I knew you were going to say that one. I knew it.
Yeah, Ethan knew that. And the reason why I bring those up is both of those are actually essentially thought experiments. And I don't know if either of you are familiar with either of them, but
I'm not.
I'm not either.
Well, with Detroit Become Human, it is a game about, and it's not a game like, you know, you go in and you go in and you are presented with scenarios and you control a character through the scenarios. And the whole point of the game is that there are essentially androids that have AI, and the AI has gotten to such a point that it begins to get squishy of who is human and who is not. And
they basically all pass the Turing test, more or less.
Yeah, essentially. And then Horizon Zero Dawn, it's a little bit more of a typical video game, but its story is, it is what if the humans created weaponry to the point where they essentially destroy themselves, and they figure out a way how to essentially create a time capsule that can rebirth humanity via technology. And that happens, but the way it happens doesn't happen the way it was planned. And essentially humans kind of start over almost, but with the wreckage of the previous civilization around them. And the thought experiment that carries, that's a little bit more of a traditional story in terms of video games, but it has an interesting thought experiment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Once we sort of built this lens of philosophical thought experiments, it suddenly became really clear that, you know, it's obviously not just superhero comics. It's the whole realm of fiction, specifically speculative fiction, fantasy and sci-fi that is about creating alternate worlds and imagining something that's similar but also significantly different in some key aspect. Yeah, all of these are thought experiments. Absolutely.
Yeah, because obviously what happens oftentimes with the sci-fi is that it's taking things that do exist in our own life, or it's fringe science to some extent, but it's ideas that already are in place and kind of pushing it to the nth degree to see what would happen if. Obviously, all kinds of movies have those kind of things too, like Terminator or whatnot. If technology got one step further and got a little bit smarter, would it deem us necessary, or the Matrix, those kind of things too. So it is interesting that thought experiments have pretty much been around since storytelling's been around. You can argue that storytelling in and of itself is nothing more than a thought experiment.
Yeah, I think you might be right about that. That's nothing that we didn't push completely in that direction, but I'm persuaded. And I wanted to. No, I am. And Ethan, I think I got it right. You mentioned the Turing test before in the context of Detroit Become Human, and the Turing test. Right, Alan Turing proposed a thought experiment.
Yes, literally, yeah.
Yeah, literally in, I guess, the 50s, I'm going to say, plus or minus a decade, something like that. So the Turing test, we probably all know, Alan Turing tried to figure out when we would say a machine could think, and it's when it could make us think that it could think. That is when he pictured it behind a screen, and the computer was giving a printout and somebody was reading it because he didn't have in mind an Android or anything like that. But this was a thought experiment. And now, lo and behold, sometimes thought experiments become actual experiments or laboratory experiments. And we might be there sometime soon 100%. With that one.
Very much so.
I'm going to just to return briefly to Swamp Thing. The way you just described that, Nathaniel, that matches Donald Davidson's view that a word is meaningful if it is interpreted as being meaningful. What's interesting with the Turing test is that there's currently an annual competition for TalkBots. Now, TalkBot is not sentient. It is just a machine that spits out, pre-written phrases that are responding to cues in something that you type to it. So there's no possibility of a thinking sentient entity that's using words meaningfully. But some of these TalkBots are programmed so effectively that they're coming pretty close to fooling someone to thinking that it's a human being that's writing these words.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is fascinating because that means that according to interpretation, a word is meaningful if you interpret it as having come from a meaningful source, which is the opposite of Swamp Man, which argues that no, the speaker has to have learned the meaning of the word and use it meaningfully. So there's really, The Turing test is using a very specific definition, which is tricky. I'm not sure if I agree with it, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Well, part of the, I guess, not the flaw in the Turing test, but part of what it is essentially is you're talking about artificial sentience. But the thing is, there's no such thing as artificial sentience. If you're sentient, you're sentient. So if a machine believes it can think or reason, it can think and reason. There's no stopping it. Essentially, it's the same thing as a person. What's the difference, really?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the question, I think.
Yeah. But there's something that you brought up before. I think it was Nathaniel that brought it up. Was this, you're talking about? I know later on in your book, later on, much further on, talk about. You mentioned how the visual image is obviously a comic book in particular is a visual medium, but it's also an interpretive medium. Mm-hmm. And you guys kind of get into like I think it's what caped communication.
Yes.
Yes. You talk about the idea essentially like if Superman is standing on a building looking over the city, how would, just because he's doing that, it's obviously the image in and of itself on face value says that Superman is on top of a building looking over his city. You could interpret that as a protector watching over a city. You could interpret that as a god believing he's better than the city, whatever you want it to be, wherever you want it to be. But that's kind of the idea, is that it's art, essentially. So anyone can interpret the visual stimuli or the different types of images that we're seeing in any way they want to. And that, again, boils down to, like you said, past experiences, your own philosophy on people, on characters, on things. So it's all these things kind of work together.
And the key there is you interpret the image according to how you imagine the artist intended to communicate something to you. So you're assuming intentionality. You're assuming that there's an artist who's trying to get an idea across to you. And sometimes the idea is a little muddled, in which case you have to sort of work with it, and sometimes it's a bit of a challenge. Nathaniel and I, when we were working this together, when I brought him that idea of like, well, how, what are these images doing? And he responded, and this is how we sort of went back and forth. Sorry, I'm going to go on a tangent. I would sort of bounce the tennis ball of a comic book situation to him, and he would return the ball with a specific philosopher's response to it. So in this case, Nathaniel, who was it?
Are you thinking of Paul Grice?
I am.
Have a hive mind. Those two have a hive mind.
Yeah. In fact, that's where I thought you were going, but maybe that's maybe I'll raise that. But just to fill in the Paul Grice point, so Paul Grice was a philosopher of language who died a couple of decades ago, and he had this view that there are two sort of main ways that we communicate or interpret things. We more or less do so literally, he called that conventionally, or we more or less do it conversationally. And the main difference is that conventionally is sort of what you get if you looked up the word in a dictionary, or most people would agree. And this can apply to images too. So Superman standing on top of a building, yeah, there could be some difference. Is he a god? Is he a protector? But we're still going to agree it's a man on top of a building because conventionally that's what it depicts. But some things, and Chris had this example of Spider-Man and his Spidey sense where you can see, I don't know, Z's coming out of
little lines coming off of his head.
Yeah, little lines coming off of his head. Yeah, conventionally, I mean, that doesn't happen. He doesn't have little lines coming off of his head. It's meant in the context of the conversation to make us think there's something like instinctive or supernatural, maybe not supernatural, instinctive or superpowered going on. Right. So, yeah, so just as words, sometimes you have to figure out what they mean based on the conversation and not literally their meaning. We argued the same thing for images.
Yep.
Exactly. Well, what's interesting about that too, and Nate knows this. One of my comic books is actually my head illustrator is in the Philippines, and so even though he's fairly fluent in English, there's still some things that are just kind of can get lost in translation. So sometimes I would try to, in the most colloquial way, to depict one of my characters. The book was called Slade and Ash, and I would say Slade and Ash are embracing each other like brothers would. And for him, the way brothers embrace each other in the Philippines is different than the way they would in America.
Right.
So it's his own past experience. And he would draw that image, and the image would look completely different and almost wrong to me. So
context. Yeah.
It's context.
That's good.
So the thing I mentioned that I thought we were going to, that Ethan, you were going to ask us about when you said, Chris and I have a hive mind, or minds that hopefully don't give you hives. Hopefully it's the first version. Chris was, I think, about to say that comics are produced by hive minds in a way. They're writers and illustrators and inkers and managers of the company and people pitching the stories. And now there are marketers, right? And there are movie studios that are behind them too. So it seems like there could be not just one comic book author, but in a way, I don't know, dozens of people who are involved in a storyline. And the way that we closed the book, or at least the last substantive chapter, was, can we make sense of there being all these multiple people involved in writing a single comic book, and yet there's just a single story that emerges? And we wind up arguing that it's as if there's a single author, that all these individual people are in a way acting in a single voice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's interesting. Almost, I mean, not full-blown intelligent design, but the idea that there is kind of a through line delivered.
Yeah, a through line.
And it includes not just the plot and story elements, but all of the artwork. So you've got, I mean, a standard comic, particularly something from DC or Marvel, which are the comics we were looking at, the story idea might originate from an editor. It then might go to a writer who writes a script. The script is handed to a penciler who sketches out the entire issue, and then an inker finishes it, and then a colorist adds, obviously, color. Another writer might come in and add dialogue, and then another artist comes in and letters the dialogue. All of these different people are contributing, and it's odd because it's not simply one person's in charge. You know, when you look at films, and this probably isn't accurate, but culturally, we look at a film as being, there's one person in charge, it's the director.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's somewhat true, but, you know, that's a kind of a fiction that we accept. Culturally, it's like, yeah, the director is the equivalent of an author of a novel. In comics, there isn't really the same thing going on. You know, sometimes the artist is considered the primary creator, sometimes the writer, but then all of those can be subdivided multiple times so that you just have this enormous group of people. And in what possible sense can a group of people have one coherent set of intentions? And,
right.
And again, Nathaniel came up with the answer with another philosopher.
Right. So there's a philosopher who's still writing, still up and kicking, a guy named Daniel Dennett, who's in Boston. And he has this theory, and Ethan, in a way, this picks up on what you were saying, that there's no such thing as artificial sentience. That's his view. If it makes sense to talk about a bunch of transistors and gears and sensors in an android, and that android being conscious, then it makes sense, he says, to talk about, here's the controversial part, a bunch of neurons in our brains, all these different parts working together and being conscious. And our extension, therefore, it makes sense to talk about all these artists and plotters and inkers and story people and sketchers and editors, all of them collectively as, in a way, being conscious, being a single author.
A single mind, I see what you're saying.
A single mind.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
That's very interesting.
And Dennett's way of putting it is to say, hey, that's basically what we are.
Yeah.
How else can you explain, right, how the human body and the human brain works? It's not like there's one neuron that's in charge, right? It's the brain's this complicated thing, and yet it's all unified somehow.
Right.
It fits. And what's interesting about that is it like you said, it's like us. And as we grow and evolve as a people and also more globally as a society, so do these characters. And the neurons, quote unquote, the inker, the writer, the author, the, whatever, they evolve and change as time goes on. So
But one thing too, going back to what Nathaniel and Chris both said, was that the idea of this hive mentality or collective consciousness, it also transcends time. Because, like, for example, in the comic world, when Bob Kane and Bill Finger created Batman way back in the 40s, their interpretation of Batman in some ways still very present today, 70 some odd years later by modern day writers and modern day artists and modern day storytellers of that nature. Same way with films. When Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, it was brought to life on the big screen by Peter Jackson and his whole army of actors and other storytellers, writers, editors, people in the wardrobe department, actors. It's an amazing thing. So it's a hive mentality can almost essentially, in a way, once an idea exists or once a hive mind its birth, it can almost like never die, or it just keeps growing or keeps changing. It keeps, like you said, evolving. It doesn't get extinguished to some extent, which is an interesting thing about it.
Yeah, so I was once at a philosophy talk maybe a decade or two ago, and there was a guy who stood up on the stage. I'm forgetting his name at this point, but he said he was going to prove to all of us in the audience that he has like the total knowledge of all of humanity. He's mastered all of human knowledge, and we all thought he was crazy. And then what he did was he pulled out the very first iPhone, and he went to Wikipedia and he said, "Look at me! I've got all basically of human knowledge at my fingertips." and his point was right that it's not just that there's a hive mind or that we share information between other people; it's that we do it with technology also. So I don't know like how to. I live what do I live like 6-ish hours from New York City by car. I don't know how to get to New York City, but I drive it. I've drove it the other summer all the time because I just punched it into my GPS. So in a way, I do know how to drive to New York City because I just punch into my GPS. So it's more, right? The hive is more, in a way, it's more than just the bees. It's the bees and the hive, right? And the honey and the comb and all together.
I mean, is there a difference between having access to the knowledge and actually having the knowledge stored in your brain? Not really.
That's what, I mean, a lot of people think not really. It's just, so it used to be, right? You could keep track of things by writing them down or by memorizing them or by putting them up in the cloud, right?
I think as soon as we invented words that could be written down, that was the radical change to the human, because at that point you could export areas of your brain, you could export memory and then come back to it. So, the iPhone's fantastic, but it's just a slight variation on the encyclopedia, the paperback encyclopedia that's sitting on a shelf.
Right.
Well, exactly. And the interesting thing about that to me is how, as technology evolves, because it's kind of like the way I've always viewed it when I've had these discussions before about like the library is the memory of the computer, is the storage of the computer. And our brain is the RAM. It's the taking that information and then utilizing it. Well, when we were writing, it was you needed a library for a ton of information, and then you had to physically get through it to use it. So the RAM was very, limited in that way. But now that we have the library in our pocket, it's like, my friends and I always used to joke that the smartphone has killed the bar argument because, anytime a disagreement comes up, you just pull out your phone and go, oh yeah, Janis Joplin died in such and such year. She was 27 when she died. It just completely kills all arguments because you can find it right there. So it's interesting to me how as technology evolves, it makes us more efficient in the utilization of knowledge and the fact that it makes it that we even don't have to use the built-in storage as much as we used to. And like, what is that going to mean?
So if I can push back on that, interestingly to me at least, writing superhero thought experiments was a little different than other research I've done because when I'm researching those topics, if I want to cite other scholarship, that's pretty easy to get electronically. There's so many digital ways of handling that. But we were working with old comics, and and I could not access them online. So I ended up, I was ordering old copies of like 1970s Avengers, 1960s Fantastic Four, beat up copies, but I had to order them. They had to come to me by snail mail. I had to, flip through them and read them carefully. And so it was a strangely tactile experience very different from other research that I've been doing, even with other comics, because it was just, these were old musty comics we were dealing with.
Right. There was no streamline. It was like old school, Indiana Jones digging through a tomb, basically.
Well, but that's the thing. Like, it's as time goes on, like the digitization. Like you can like now you can get those subscriptions through like a Marvel has it, and like Comixology I think is one.
Yeah, and I've never. And you're right. When we started that research, when we started this book, I had not even. Yeah, I didn't even know about that tech. So I guess if I'd been a little smarter, I could have done that. But I have to, honestly, I really like, okay, I'm going to admit it, a giant box of beat up comics from my childhood up in my attic. And one of the first things I did was pull it down and start flipping through them. So these are like, from 1977, whenever. And it was sort of a real pleasure just returning to those childhood comics.
Yeah, I think there's actual, like, something might get lost. No offense to the whole digital age, but I feel like actually holding the physical copy of the book in your hand, or books in your hand, that you're actually feeling, knowing that other people before you may have held it, as far as maybe even like the writer himself may have held it in autographed or whatnot, knowing that this has actually traveled a long great distance to get to you, and holding that history essentially in your hands, and being able to witness it first in the flesh. There's something to that. There's an extra weight, I feel like, to that adds to the storytelling.
Well, even if you go onto the Creativity in Progress Facebook page, which everybody should do, check it out, Creativity in Progress on Facebook.com. You can see a post that I just did the other day. I was going through my comics here at home, and I came across an art book and 4 Star Wars comics, the number 1 through 4 of Star Wars from the 70s, the Marvel.
Yep.
And it was like, and I saw those, and it was just like, oh my God, I haven't felt these feelings in years,
Right. Yeah, it's something there. There's an authenticity there that doesn't come across as much. It's just on the screen.
Yeah. Oh, that's why I still have a pull list. I still, go and get my comics at Telegraph Art and Comics Uptown. Plug. I still go there because it's like you said, it's that tactile experience. Whereas, like digitally, like that, I only go digital if it's a comic that I'm like kind of interested in, not quite sure, checking it out, kind of thing. It's but times are changing. And
I was glad to get the copy of your book, Nathaniel and Chris, actually in my hands, that I have right here with me right now. I actually like be able to hold it. And I like the idea, too, that this is a compendium of all those things that you guys, all those other past issues, all those other past thought experiments by countless past writers and illustrators and whatnot that worked on these books over the years. You pretty much condensed all their ideas and their thoughts into this one tome of sorts. So it's kind of a cool idea, cool way to.
Well, Ethan, you're really very kind. I don't have even such a high opinion of my book. As you seem to do, but no, we're really flattered, and I guess I just wanted to mention that the way that we close the book is to suggest that, well, we can talk about philosophy and comics, which is what all of us have mostly been talking about, but then towards the end we've been talking about like the philosophy of comics, what's special about comics as a medium. Not just whether it's digital or tactile, though that's certainly part of it, but also what does reading comics do to the reader? And we talked about, how it's a more vivid way of transmitting a story or teaching lessons. But Chris and I came upon this, this conclusion that in a way, when you read a superhero comic book, you are in a way yourself like the subject of a thought experiment. It's like the comic book authors and writers, artists, and all those other people who made the comic are treating you as, someone who's being exposed to this creative world. And you're right. It's as if you're the character in print. And in a way, they're the ones reading you because they're putting you in the situation that they created and they're watching things play out. So, so we thought the comics had this really nice sort of symmetry, or maybe that's the wrong word, maybe reciprocal relationship where you can explore thought experiments with them, but if you really want to understand what they're doing, maybe you should understand comics themselves as a kind of thought experiment done on their readers.
Right on, absolutely. I never read a book like this before. I've had brief discussions about this kind of stuff before, but never gotten into a full-blown book about it. And so, thank you very much for both of you guys for writing it and taking the time to make it happen.
Oh, are you kidding? Thank you to both of you, and to poor Mick, who I sort of thrust myself upon when I had a comic book store. And said, hey,
he loves it. Yeah, he appreciates it.
Yeah, no,
He's
thank
grateful.
you. You've all been really kind.
Yeah, he are you kidding? He was like, he came over to me and he was like, guess who I just talked to? Like, oh my God. He was so excited. And we were very excited that you guys came on today. So thank you for that. So before we let you go, is there anything that you wanted to, like obviously your book, but was there anything else you wanted to maybe plug, talk about, mention that you wanted to get out there into the ether?
I'll add just one more detail that I thought, writing this book, we were using philosophy as a lens to study superhero comics, but we kept going back and forth to what extent is this a work of philosophy or is it a work of literary criticism about comics? And it's a little of both. One of the moments that I found, and I'm not sure if Nathaniel might not even agree with this, but one moment that I found particularly interesting is that when the superhero comics really created a challenge to traditional philosophy. I'll just name one specific. We have I enjoyed writing it immensely because it was so convoluted. A chapter that's about exploring how time works with Dr. Doom's time machine in Marvel. And it's, first it was simply, this is a nice way to explore the standard philosophical approaches of, time is eternal or only the present exists or the past and the present exist, but the future doesn't, and it's slowly building. But the more we got into it, the more complicated it got, and it really created, Nathaniel was referring earlier to the vividness of thought experiments. The fact that you have these multiple writers building on each other, they built this extraordinarily complicated thought experiment that actually presented some deeper challenges to my understanding of traditional philosophy. And ultimately, one of the challenges regarding the philosophy of time, every philosopher that I'm aware of, and Nathaniel has one basic assumption that time, whatever it is consistent. And if you look at Marvel, you realize that if you read them as the multiple authors as philosophers, they have a pretty radical idea, which is, no, it's not. Time might sometimes do one thing, but at another time it might do something completely different. And that is a kind of interesting insight that we only got to by taking comics very seriously as if they really were philosophical thought experiments.
Absolutely. It sounds like, first off, I just want to say, I remember that exact chapter because it was called Collaborating Time, which is a perfect pun pertaining to but also, it sounds like you guys initially thought that you would approach comic books with philosophy, and you kind of ended up by the end of the journey, you realize you could kind of approach philosophy with comics. So it's really cool. And I guess the thing is too is that most people on the surface, the layperson definitely thinks of comics as kids' books. They don't think of comics as having any deeper meanings or any philosophy in them at all. They're just picture books for nobodies, more or less. And it's when you actually dig into it that you realize, oh my gosh, these stories are just as insightful as anything from any other writers in the past. So it's I'm really cool. I'm really glad to hear that you guys come to that realization as well.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up for today. Was there anything else y'all wanted to cover or talk about before we let you go?
I think we're good. I just wanted to say thank you again to both of you.
All right.
Thank you. We're honored. We're definitely honored.
Yes. Yes, it was great.
Thank you.
And if you think of that podcast name of your friends, Chris, if you send that my way, that'd be great. And also, Chris.
I was also on MuggleNet.
Okay. Oh, cool.
Yeah, we were talking about whether Harry Potter's a superhero.
Oh, nice.
Oh, my lordy lord.
Oh man,
that's a lot of experiment. That's a serious.
Oh, I have thoughts. I have thoughts.
I have too many. I have way too many. That's a whole other podcast. That's not another episode. That's a whole other podcast.
I'll come back and talk to you about that.
yes. Well, we'll have to do that. And the invitation is open to both of you. If y'all would ever want to come back, anything you want to talk about, please come back. We would love to have you.
Oh, well, thank you again. That's really, really kind. It's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. We're going to go ahead and we'll let you go, and then we will we'll wrap it up, and we'll let you know. We're going to drop the episode next week, and I'll let you know ahead of time, so that way you can let your people know that it's being dropped.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Awesome. Absolutely.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you guys.
Have a wonderful night, guys. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks. Good night.
Night. Okay, so yeah, that was great. That was a great interview with Chris and Nathaniel. We had Nathaniel, Nathan, and Ethan all in the same room. Poor Chris.
I felt so bad for Chris.
Poor Chris and his monosyllabic name. But yeah, they were great. They were really they were fantastic.
I've never felt smarter and dumber at the same time than those two guys.
Well, there were a couple times where I was like I wanted to make the joke, like, I'm not high enough for this, like because there were parts like it was fascinating, and I understood them, like, and I was getting it, but it's a lot of stuff to process. Like your brain's just going like, whoa, but it's really great. I'm really glad they came on and chatted about that. So we'll definitely have to have them on again.
Absolutely, and I'm genuinely honored that they decided to come on our little podcast. Our little podcast is growing. Podcast is growing. I'm so glad they came on here. I'm so glad they actually, bizarrely enough, they reached out to Mick, which blows my mind. They reached out to our own Mick Van Winkle. So it's great.
They cornered him in Telegraph, but oh man, he was so excited. He was so excited when he was done talking to. He came over and he was like I'm not kidding. Like when I said he came over, he's like, guess who I just talked to? He was so excited. So
awesome stuff.
So yeah. So okay. So let's. Like I said, this is about ready for us to put this puppy to bed. Anything you wanted to plug, Ethan, today?
Yes. I recently I was hungry, and I decided to go and get a burger. To end my week of driving and lifting and everything else and writing and whatnot. And I asked them to put extra bacon on there. And I ate it with each bite. I said, "This is for you, Nate. All this porky grease is just for you." Yes. So I like to plug pork. I mean, not like that. That's not what I meant. What I meant is I like to promote eating pork.
I would like to point out that was all you. That was all you right there. Oh, and I also would like to point out that I had a Magic the Gathering story to tell during that interview, and I tamped it down. Tamped it down for you. Yes.
Our little Nate's growing up to a fine young man.
I know.
But I will point out that you did mention Horizon Zero Dawn again. So it's a trade-off.
But that's not like one of my obsessions. Like it's a mini obsession. It's like an obsessed lit, like it's not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's obsessed lit. I would say Magic's at the top, then one of your kids, then Horizon Zero Dawn, then your other kid. That's kind of the order of things. Yeah.
And I really can't take full credit for tamping down the Magic Gathering thing. It was the fact that the part of the story was contingent on the fact of me knowing the name of the card in the story. And I couldn't pull it up in time, and the conversation had moved away, and I knew it would be too much to dive in on that. But
so, are you confessing that you were feverishly searching on the interwebs to find the card name, but you couldn't do it?
Oh, of course. Like I even had it up, and it was like, and I can't even remember the name of the card now. But anyways, so. Hey,
classic Nate. Classic.
Yes, I am nothing if not truthful.
You are not nothing.
Quiet you. So my plugging for the day is actually going to be to talk about our new affiliate situation. We have a new affiliate. We're with Printful.com. It's where you can go and get merchandise and all that kind of stuff. It's where we get our merchandise. We have the merchandise. We have it in hand. And it's awesome merchandise. They make really high quality stuff. We've been really pleased with the stuff that they make. So if you go on to, and I'm vamping because I have these ideas.
Stall.
Let's see.
While you're doing that, we might as well go ahead and, since Ari's not here, we can go ahead and just bash on her all we want. Do you ever notice that Ari is got to be the most feminine one out of the three of us?
Oh my Lord, dude, she's gonna get a plane ticket. And then she's gonna come there and kick your tail feather and then charge you for the plane ticket. Like it's
exactly. That's exactly what she would do.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: if all it takes for me to get her here is by calling her a feminine type, is to get her here, I will gladly do that. I haven't seen her in over a month. I miss her so.
Oh,
yeah. And I told her to bring you, of course.
Okay, of course. Yes. Oh my God. So I've got there. We have vamped. So if you go to
nice.
Yes. If you go to www.printful.com/a/CIP network, you will go ahead and go there and check out the stuff, and it would help out the channel. And the great thing about it is you can use it to set up a store if you want, or you can use it if you're like, you know what? I made this cool design and I want it on a t-shirt. You can go to printful.com and do that, and you will get, for a reasonable price, you'll be able to get your design on a t-shirt. Or if you make a lot of designs and you want to make a lot of t-shirts, Printful can do that too. So go ahead and check that out, www.printful.com/a/CIP network. Okay, I think that does it. Any other things before I wrap this baby up?
No, sir. I think you've done an excellent job tonight, Nate. You sound very handsome. I can't see you tonight.
Oh, yes. Oh, well, you know what? We should hop on the chat, because there's a, yeah, you'll see. We should do a quick video call if you're able to after. Because
this sounds the most ominous, seductive thing I've ever heard. Yes. It's like Basic Instinct meets Indecent Proposal.
Oh man, see, where's the sax music? I really need sax music here. All I have is this. That's really not sexy.
That's the least sexy thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, I need to get like Kenny G sax music up in here. Okay.
Yeah, you do.
All right. So so I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this puppy up. You can find Ari on Twitter at Ornerine. Sorry, the is not there. That is. Let me try that again.
Yeah,
I'm editing that part out.
Take two. No, keep it in.
Not reflective at all on Ari. That was just me mispronouncing Twitter. Anyway,
what you literally did, you literally said her name and then spit. That's what happened.
It was an honor for every time we mentioned the blood pouring thing, and she goes bleh. Anyway, so I'll go with that.
Sure.
I'll go with that. You can find Ari on Twitter at Ornerine. You can find Ethan at echelongnovels.com. You can find Nate at nathanbeattyvo.com. You can find more information on the podcast at echelongnovels.com/CIP, or our new website, www.thecipnetwork.com. You can call us at 434-481-1787, and you can email us directly at Nate@thecipnetwork.com. Check us out on YouTube. Check us out on Twitch. You can support us directly at thecipnetwork.com/support. Or you can go to our Patreon, search for us on Patreon. Our intro and outro music is the song Amigos by Platinum Butterfly, copyright 2015, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 3.0. You can find more of their stuff at dig.ccmixter.org, featuring Clarence Simpson and Susan Oohs Oz. And I just realized that I used the Kevin MacLeod music I think it's called like Forest, and you can find it on in Compotech, and it's Creative Commons Attribution 4.0. Anyway, as always, thank you all so much for listening, and y'all have a wonderful day.
Clarence Thomas.
Ah, crap. We're leaving it in.
That's how he haunts you. Yeah, we're leaving all that in.
Oh, yeah.
Pork.